Hello, hello. This is Osman Parvez with the House Einstein podcast. This is podcast number 11, and I'm here with Hamish Crab.
Hello, hello.
Today's topic is on real estate negotiations, a topic that is fraught with potential war stories and chaos and maybe best practices too. Just as a little bit of background before we jump into this topic, um, my experience is most people in the profession don't like to talk about real estate negotiations, and a lot of newer agents or inexperienced agents who don't do a lot of deals also aren't sure of how to advise their clients. And there's quite a spectrum of professionalism when it comes to real estate negotiations. For a little bit more background on myself, I've been in real estate sales for about 21 years, in the industry for about 21 years. Didn't start off as a real estate agent or broker, was an analyst first for a company doing a development on Nantucket. And even before that, worked in the professional world, in the investment world on equities research, in particular in New York, and was involved with other types of transactions in investment banking, and then ended up in real estate quite unexpectedly. And then briefly here in Denver, also worked for a firm that I talked about in another podcast called Republic Financial, where I was involved in a lot of negotiations, or at least had a seat at the table to see what was going on. Although I certainly wasn't a principal negotiator or the principal in the transaction, but was party to the conversations, discussions, strategy discussions around everything from commercial aircraft leases to real estate portfolio acquisitions. And it was fascinating watching the decisions being made. And at the time, I remember getting the content material for the Harvard Business School's negotiation coursework, the executive negotiation coursework. One of my colleagues actually went to the school and took that. I think it's a weekend course or something. It was really pricey, so I didn't go, but I got the content. And years later, took a certified negotiator course on real estate, the CNE designation, which I have. I don't market that designation, but I have that designation, and that's actually modeled off of the Harvard Business School course on negotiation. So I care a tremendous amount about negotiation, and I have treated it as an area of mastery for at least the last 20 years. It's something I care about, and I'm constantly working at improving. I've read many books on the subject, although I would not market myself as a expert. I probably qualify given 20 years of experience in real estate negotiations, 21 years of experience, but I feel like claiming you're an expert in something often means you're not. Like the people most promoting themselves as an expert on a subject often are not actually experts in the subject. So I will say I'm probably better than average, and I do care about doing it to the best of my ability, and I'm constantly working on improving that skill set. So that's my background in real estate negotiations, and having done this now for 21 years, mostly in Colorado, we've got some things to say about it, and I felt like this would be a good topic for today's podcast. And also this week we had a bit of a heated negotiation, and it's off. So as we choose podcast topics, sometimes the topic is very fresh because of something that's recently occurred in our transactions. And at the moment, we're managing a number of listings and a number of buy-side deals for our clients, which are always the priority. But as we learn lessons, these podcasts are really helpful for us to share those lessons with others. And negotiation is not going to be a one podcast topic and done. I'll say that much, that we're probably only going to brush the surface, but we're going to get into it and talk about things you probably don't hear realtors talk about when it comes to managing negotiations in real estate transactions.
You nailed it. Yep.
So that's the intro. Yeah. And what's funny is people feel like if you've negotiated a car deal, you could probably handle a real estate negotiation. And, I'm not here to tell anybody not to handle their own real estate negotiations, but the difference between an experienced negotiator who does a lot of transactions and understands the norms and how they play with the contract in the state that you're in. Here in Colorado, we have a very unique contract. Every time I see a contract from another state, I'm like, wow, that we are so different, and in some ways more advanced. But not knowing that how the contract plays with the contingencies is sort of a recipe for a disaster. I'll never forget, one of the times that this became really apparent. I was representing a buyer for a condo downtown, and the sellers had lost their primary home in the 4 Mile fire. And they were selling this condo to fund the the rebuilding of their primary home. And so I only found that out later. But this condo had been on the market for a while, and it was a FSBO, for sale by owner. And the client I was representing on the buy side was a real estate analyst. And we got along fabulously because we shared that analytical background. And this property is spectacular. It overlooks a park with picture perfect Flatiron views. It's on the upper level. No one's above you, so you don't hear any noise above you. And it's in the heart of downtown. And we submitted a low offer. It had been on the market for a while. This is when you could do these sorts of things. The market had tons of inventory, and they had overpriced it. And we submitted what most people would call a low ball. And we gave them a midnight response deadline or something like that. Maybe it wasn't midnight, but it was late. And we gave them overnight to think about it, and then a late response deadline. And I expected a counter, right? The goal of offering low is usually to get a counter. And this is not exactly a secret. And I'm not going to pretend that there are secrets in real estate negotiations, but typically, and it's not always the case, but typically when you offer low, you're offering low. And maybe you substantiate it with comps if they exist. Maybe you substantiate why your offer is so low based on the condition of the property. It doesn't really matter, but you have your reasons for why you're offering low. Maybe it's all you can afford, whatever. But you know that you're probably not going to get it at your first offer. And even the most, I guess, basic level of advice for somebody who's acting as your agent in a transaction is don't accept the first offer, counter. And the reason
even
countering
if it's little, right?
Even if it's little. So the reason countering is so important is that if you don't counter the offer, buyers typically feel, or the other party, the seller typically feels, sorry, let me back up. If you don't counter, right, the low offer, usually the buyer concludes something's wrong. Like they're leaving money on the table. I'm missing something. It's too easy. It crashes the matrix. And so even if this offer is the perfect price, it's more than you anticipated, the advice that we usually give our seller, if we're representing the seller, is to counter on something in the contract. Let's go through it with a fine-tooth comb, find the mistakes. We'll fix those in the counter. And even if there are no mistakes, which occasionally we find there's no mistakes in the contract, let's at least change a few dates. Maybe we just move them a day or two. And you do it for two reasons. One is because it forces the buyer to pause and reflect on the change, which slows down the decision-making process. And two, it makes it a little difficult. There's a tinge of push-pull. And without that push-pull, people feel like something's wrong. And they will look for other reasons to break up the deal. And I learned about this, actually, Hamish, from the first time I was like 22 or 23 years old. I was between undergrad and grad school, and I took a job in auto sales. And we had this, I worked at a Volkswagen dealership only for a year, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, and we had this bright yellow GTI. And this thing was just sitting in our showroom for months. No offers, nobody interested. And then one day, two young engineers show up from GE, which was a local employer. And they were probably in their mid-20s, first time getting a real job, had real money. And they walked in, looked at the car. We took it for a test drive. And they said, okay, we'll take it. And I said, oh, okay. And I went into the manager's office, which is what you do. It's the same principal agent separation that you see in a real estate transaction. And I said, these guys are ready to buy the car. I was beaming. I was so happy. I was so thrilled. Like, it's a done deal. Yeah. And that's when the boss said to me, you're not going to like this, but you need to go back in there and ask for more money. I'm like, what? He's like, you have to. You have to go back to this buyer and ask them for more money. And I was just so annoyed with him because we would have sold this all day long at this price, but he forced me to go back, and I asked for more money, and I said, look, this is a really hot car. We're getting so much interest in it. I need to, if you want this car today, we're going to have to get $2,000 more from you. And they looked at each other and they're like, okay, I want this car, no problem. And the honest truth is that this car was rare, but there was nobody else buying this car, even at MSRP. And I had to go back and ask for more money. And my boss at the time, who was 20 years older than me, and I think he's still in this industry, told me that if you don't do that, the deal's going to fall apart.
Was the $2,000 insignificant to the entire price, or was it a little bit more of a kind of?
I mean, I don't remember the price of the car at this time. It might have been in the 30s.
Okay.
This is a long time ago. It wasn't insignificant. It was, in my mind, it was huge, right? I was living paycheck to paycheck and just learning, right? And so I felt like I was asking for an enormous amount of money at the time. And to these guys, it was nothing, and they agreed to it, and they bought the car. And ever since then, I thought a lot about negotiations and how if it's not a little bit difficult, there's a higher probability of something falling apart. And I've seen that in real estate transactions myself. Either side I'm representing. Like if I offer low and they accept it, I have to tell my client, look, this almost never happens. And you're probably going to start to look for problems. Why is this happening? Why are you getting it? It's like the end of the Willy Wonka, the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Willy Wonka and Charlie are in the elevator. And Willy Wonka leans over, and this is the original Gene Wilder movie. I'm not sure if it's in the book this way, but Gene Wilder leans over to Charlie and says, Charlie, do you know what happened to the boy who got everything he ever wanted? And Charlie's like, no, what happens? And his eyes go wide. And Willy Wonka says, he lived happily ever after. But that's not what happens in real life. What happens in real life, if you get everything you want, you crash the matrix. And that's what happens in real estate transactions. So, and I've seen this firsthand. It's human nature to want things to be a little bit difficult, a little bit challenging. And so if you're a seller, you should always counter. If you're a buyer, you should expect a counter. And if the other side screws up and doesn't counter, you need to reset your expectations and realize you're getting an amazing deal. And you should have realized that when you wrote the offer, but your agent should be reiterating that to you and proving it to you. This shouldn't be smoke and mirrors. You should really be able to say, wow, these people, I can't believe they accepted our lowball. And that's what happened with this deal in this condo in downtown Boulder. They accepted our lowball at like the stroke of midnight at 11:59. I got the signed offer. The signed lowball came back, and I immediately texted or called or emailed. I can't remember, this is so long ago, but I immediately contacted the buyer, and I'm like, you're not going to believe this. Like I can't, like they were doing a FSBO, so they had no professional advice. And at the very last minute, they signed it. And this is after posturing with me that it was never going to fly. It's not going to happen. And they should have countered. They left at least $10,000 or $20,000 on the table. I vaguely recall the price point at this time being around $600,000, and we were willing to go significantly higher than our original offer. We were kind of expecting it to land somewhere in the middle, and it didn't. She got it for a screaming deal. She still owns it today. I hope she knows how rare it is. And it's one of the few instances where the original offer was accepted, and it's 100% because this seller did not have professional advice. And I'm still flabbergasted at how much money they left on the table. So the reason you want an agent and principal separation is so you don't make emotional decisions. So the person who's in theory familiar with the process and the structure of this agreement can help guide you through how to manage expectations, how to structure contingencies, how to stay within norms. It's not just about the price. There are other elements to it that result in a good deal. And the psychological sense of things being a little bit difficult is usually a sign of a good deal. And they say, there's a saying that first, if the deal doesn't work for everyone, there's not going to be a deal. It has to work for both parties. But they're also, a sign of a good deal is if neither party is entirely thrilled with the deal, right? Mm-hmm. At least they act like they're not thrilled with the deal. A good agent helps set expectations of where you should land in this negotiation. So here, for example, in Colorado, in Boulder specifically, if it's a seasoned listing, it's pretty typical to see 1% to 3% off the list price at the low to mid end of the market. At the higher end of the market, we can sometimes see 7%, 8% discounts, especially if it's a stale list. If it's a stale listing, the higher the discount typically goes. And it's almost never that I've been able to negotiate over 10%. And the times I have, these is a very stale listing. It's the fourth quarter. It's an estate sale. The seller is fed up with dealing with their own listing agent. The price has been steadily declining. They listed it in the spring. They've gone through the whole estate sale process with all the possessions inside. And now the family is like, I can't believe we're going to have to deal with this for another year. And we swoop in with a 13 or 14% low ball. And they're like, okay, we'll do it for 11 or whatever. Like, they just want to be done. And sometimes that really is beneficial if there's family members, because they're dividing up the net proceeds 3 ways anyway. So suddenly, a $50,000 difference split, among 4 family members is, $12,500 a piece or whatever. Like, it's irrelevant, $50,000, when you've been dealing with this issue for the course of actually probably longer than a year with an estate sale, because of the whole probate process and all the rest. So you have to know who you're negotiating against. Okay. So I feel like, Hamish, you are welcome to ask questions that occur to you on the fly, because in some ways you could certainly ask the question a buyer or seller might ask. So feel free at any point as we kind of go through our topic outline.
No, at the moment you're nailing it. I'll say too, we've seen estate sales where the heirs have already spent the money, so to speak, and so they won't budge at all. And that's a whole different beast. But.
True. I mean, that's the other thing about the estate sale is often the people that are inheriting the asset have psychologically spent the money, but usually that means they're willing to, the motivation is higher, that they'll accept a lower offer rather than stick to their guns on whatever the price was. Unfortunately, a lot of people that, end up with an estate sale property are not familiar with the market. They don't necessarily choose an agent that does a lot of transactions, and often it's like a friend recommendation, or they choose an agent that, the proxy they use for making a decision, the criteria for choosing an agent is who says my house is worth the most. And so this tends to favor agents with a lot of salesmanship and ego and bravado about, machismo about what the house might be worth. That's not the right word, because there's a lot of, it's not a macho thing, but there's a lot of ego and a lot of, hey, I can sell the house for more than any other agent. And believe me, I've been doing this for a long time, and these other agents don't know what they're doing, but let me give you the example of where I've sold houses for way more than other people, and they cherry pick a few deals from whenever, and they're very convincing, because the seller wants to believe. Right? They want to believe their house is worth a crazy number when the realistic agent may not get the business. And once you're under contract and working with this listing agent, now that you're in an exclusive agreement, you're not getting out of it. And now they can start to deliver the bad news. They're like, well, we thought it was worth a lot more, but agents I've contacted and talked to say it's not worth that. We really need to cut the price till it sells. And you're locked into this relationship with an agent that overpriced it.
Fun times. So,
all right. So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, as a buyer this year and shopping for houses, we brought up on these show notes the first round of negotiation versus the second round. And I've definitely been guilty of looking at a few listings and going, well, they're up for this, but I bet in inspection I could negotiate a little bit off, which isn't necessarily the correct way to think about it.
Well, it's not incorrect either, but it's about expectations. So what I usually advise to our buyers, Hamish, is to get your price to a place where you're happy with what you know about the house when you first write the offer. And you may get your inspection costs covered. You may get significant issues fixed or credited in the second round of negotiation. That often happens over inspection issues, or you may not. And if your expectation is that you're going to get an additional $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 off the list price or off the contract price over inspection issues, you might be disappointed. So you just have to be prepared for that. And while you're going through that process, you're paying $1,000 for due diligence costs for inspections with no guarantee of getting that back. And you're also losing out on the opportunity to negotiate on other houses because if you're practicing good faith in this transaction, you're not simultaneously writing offers on other houses. Although some agents have been known to play that game, and some buyers have been known to treat their contract like a no-cost option to buy, where they don't, even before they pay for the inspection, they terminate the contract. They don't even deposit the earnest money. They just wanted to tie it down so they could do their initial due diligence, tie up the property, and prevent other buyers from buying it. And they end up tainting the listing because now everyone thinks something's wrong with it because it now has a history of going under contract and coming back out. And often it's nothing wrong with the property. So the right way to think about it, in my opinion, and this is what we usually tell our buyers, is get your number on the first round and make sure you're happy with the property. And we'll do our best to negotiate against what are real issues on inspection on your behalf, but there's no guarantee that the seller will see them as real issues. And there could be another buyer that steps in with a backup offer and screws up the second round of negotiations. So get it in on the first round. Protect your ability to terminate if you feel like you don't have confidence in this property. And in bidding wars, our buyers often end up feeling a lot of pressure to carve back or dial back their contingencies. And that limits our ability to negotiate further if there are issues that are found. So you have to be careful and judicious. And the more you see houses, the more confident you are about this is the right house. This is the right price. I know the market. And if you haven't done that, you've only seen a couple of houses and now you're writing an offer, you're going to feel a lack of confidence in the offer price. This is one of the reasons why I hate it when buyers want to buy the first house they see. Like, no, I want you to look at a dozen houses and maybe even miss out on a few where you thought about writing an offer and then you're like, I don't believe there's really a bidding war happening. We'll revisit it on Wednesday. And then you call your agent, call me on Wednesday and say, hey, you said there were offers coming in on Monday, but it still looks like it's available on the MLS. And I said, well, let me check. Knowing the answer, I'll still check. I called the listing agent, and sure enough, they accepted an offer on Tuesday. They have 3 business days to change the MLS, and they're not going to do that because until they get the earnest money, they should delay changing the status as long as possible because that taints the listing. So you have to most of our buyers have to miss at least one before they get serious.
A little bit of pain, right? If it's too easy.
Right. Well, the problem with that, though, is, a little bit of pain in one transaction. A little bit of pain that prompts you to understand the market a little better.
Yeah.
But a lot of that you can accomplish with your agent before you even write the offer. See a lot of houses in person, see a lot of houses in a video call to go through the comps. Call the agents that have deals under contract that are similar, which is what we do, to see how many offers did they get. And the combination of that intelligence should give you a good sense of where you should land on submitting an offer. But not always. We almost offered on a listing in Lafayette last weekend, Hamish, and I don't think you saw this house. It was incredible. And our buyers initially got excited about it, but after they slept on it for a day, they decided that it's not the right house. But we had actually drafted the whole offer. And I asked the listing agent where we would have landed if we had submitted that offer. And it turned out we would have been 3rd place, even if we submitted. So I did give that feedback to our clients just so they knew that's even if we had gone in, they wouldn't have gotten the house. So all of that's market intelligence. And that's sort of, I don't know, phase 2 of before you write the offer, right? Phase 1 is you should be understanding neighborhoods. What's the right school district? What's the right property type? How much home can you afford? Go look at houses, talk about issues, pros and cons of each property. All of that's sort of stage 1, due diligence and home buying. Stage 2 is when you're writing offers, you should have already been familiarized with the market. You should know neighborhoods. You should be comfortable with HOAs that have restrictions and HOAs and homes that don't have HOAs. So if you need an RV parked in your driveway, pretty much no HOA is going to let you do it, right?
Yeah.
Then you shouldn't be looking at HOA neighborhoods. That sort of stuff is sort of early phase before you write an offer. And then once you write the offer, you should be realistic about what to expect on negotiations. But here's the catch. The listing agent isn't necessarily in the loop on norms. Most of the time they are, because most deals are done by a small percentage of agents. And so they know the norms, but not always. And when you deal with an agent that doesn't know the norms, or a seller that isn't getting good advice from that agent, anything can happen. We normally set some expectations, but even sometimes then we're completely flabbergasted by a seller that just doesn't want to address any of these things or credit anything. And maybe they've got a better offer in their pocket, or maybe they just hate how you're negotiating, or maybe they're in denial. And that's why you have to know your BATNA.
Yeah.
You're not going to ask what that is?
What's the BATNA?
Don't be shy, Hamish.
Very, very organic, this one.
So a BATNA is your best alternative to negotiated agreement. It's what happens if you walk away, right? What are your options if you don't get this house, if you just decide to walk? And that's why we look at the last 12 months of sales and see what else would have matched, how many houses per month come up that would have matched, at least in basic price range and location and physical characteristics. And that'll at least give you a baseline. Like, is there going to be a better house coming in the time period in which you expect it? And that alone will give you some confidence that you're making the right or wrong decision.
This sounds like it somewhat ties into our conversation on opportunity cost as well, right? Where it's like if you,
Go ahead.
Oh, where, if you're backing out on this particular deal, what's the cost of another house coming up, right? What are the odds of that particular property showing up again in that neighborhood with those characteristics? Yeah.
I mean, we'll bring it back to car shopping. If you can't get the deal you want on this beige Toyota Camry, well, there's probably 1,000 other beige Toyota Camrys available, and there will be another one. But if you're looking at, 1960s Ferrari coming up at Barrett-Jackson, and there's been one of these in the last decade that have come up for auction, this is it. So your best alternative to this car, this piece of art, is something completely different. It's not the same thing. There's no replacement good for
your
this
yellow
particular
GTI
or whatever it happens to be. Yellow GTI. Yeah. And cars are much easier in most cases to find an equivalent. But houses are not, especially if you're looking for the exact right house in Newlands. If you're buying a single story ranch with a basement in Table Mesa that hasn't been updated in decades, how many of these are going to likely appear, under $1 million in the next 12 months? And the answer could be, well, you're going to be 12 because last year there were 20 and prices have risen a little bit, but there's going to be plenty. Or the answer could be, no, there hasn't been one like this in 3 years. So if this is what you want, this is it. So that can affect your decision-making process and how aggressive you want to be in negotiation. But understanding the contract is also critical because here in Colorado, the seller is held to performance automatically, which means that if they decide they don't want to sell you the house because they don't like you personally, or somebody offered them $1 million more than your price, they can't very easily sell the house to this party because the contract is written so that the seller is held to performance of the deal. And their agent should be advising them of that if you default on this contract, you're likely to end up in court paying court costs and still selling the house to the people that you agreed to sell the house to. I'm not saying you can't default on a contract. You can, but there's a consequence to that for the seller. And the contract says the seller will be held to performance. The buyer in the Colorado contract to buy and sell is only held to the loss of their earnest money unless they've checked the specific performance checkbox, which we always do when I buy for myself, and about half my buyers do. It's usually a signal of confidence in the contract when you check that box because you're just you're willing to be held to the same standard of performance as the seller. Some agents, actually, I would say the majority of agents don't really understand the purpose of that checkbox because in practice, people aren't going to sue each other for performance. It locks up the entire thing. And it takes years to resolve while the seller's not selling the house to anybody else, right? It's a mess. But it's really, for the buy side, it's really a signal more than anything else. Yeah. Although legally you are saying, hold me to performance, not just my earnest money. And that's why it's so important to understand these contracts. Because if you don't, I mean, here in Colorado, we start a ticking clock the moment you go under contract. And Hamish, you're the reader of our contracts, and you put these into calendar events, and you hear me being very emphatic about how these have to be right in the calendar. They have to match the contract. If we have an amendment, we have to update, because those dates and deadlines, the time deadlines, the date deadlines, are right to negotiate
Mm-hmm.
or terminate expires
Right.
on certain, there are certain off ramps, and you have to know what these off ramps are, and you have to understand what happens if you don't reach agreement. There's no automatic extensions. Usually the contract just terminates if you object to something. And if you don't object to something, you lose the right to on that date and
You
deadline.
miss your shot. Right.
So that's why the appraisal date, like we have a deal that's in play right now, and the appraisal deadlines are actually after the loan approval deadlines and how the buyer wrote it. I mean, they're so close together for all practical purposes, it's kind of irrelevant. But the contract is written bad or badly. The appraisal deadlines should occur before final loan approval, because technically the lender can't give you final loan approval unless they have the appraisal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the appraisal is happening weeks in advance. There's no issue here with the timeline thing, but it's actually written incorrectly. So
it's one of those things you can counter on as well. I think we ended up countering on a laundry list of other inaccuracies on that one, but
yeah, and it's an agent that's been around for decades, and that often is another problem, because if they're writing bad contracts and they've been around for decades, there's usually like an XY axis for ego that says the longer you've been in the business, the higher your ego is going to be. And so it's challenging, because when we counter, we want to correct all the issues, but we don't want to make them look bad in front of their client. So we try not to create that dynamic, but sometimes it's going to happen when they make big mistakes.
Especially when you need to shore up specific details in the contract that are fairly important, you know?
You know, there's an agent on our team who's incredible at details, Sophie. And Sophie Klura has now been with the company. Actually, it's her birthday today. We need to acknowledge that.
And happy birthday, Sophie.
And happy birthday to Sophie if she's listening to this podcast. And she has incredible attention to detail, and she's a very skilled negotiator. But when she first started on the phone, she sounded like a 12-year-old. Well, she sounded young, I should say. And when you're young and you're dealing with an agent that's much older, and you sound like their grandkids, and might even be the age of their grandkids, they're going to try to leverage that. They may try to leverage that. There's some sort of egoic thing that happens. This young whippersnapper.
Who do they think they are? You know, that kind of...
Like they need to tell me the contract is wrong.
Yeah.
So that's why Sophie early on, at least in the first few years of her negotiations, would often do things via email. Once she realized that this put her at a disadvantage when people heard her youthful sound, she would mostly handle negotiations via email. And that worked much better for her. And she's so skilled at contracts. She's so detail oriented. You know, she's mostly right. When she tells me I'm wrong, she's usually right. I'm wrong on a particular aspect of a contract or two. She's very intelligent, but she has a natural disadvantage in her youth. One agent, in fact, asked her if she was the daughter of a colleague from decades ago, because Sophie's grandmother was in the industry, and she had to tell this agent, no, I'm actually the granddaughter of this agent you used to work with. And there was like a long pause and then a sigh of this person who's just shaking their head going, I can't believe my colleagues are now the grandchildren of the people I started working with all those years ago.
Yeah, that would be insane.
Okay, so we've covered intro kind of to real estate negotiations. We've kind of talked about early stage and late stage. Here in Colorado, the biggest negotiation is on price and, of course, dates and deadlines. And then the secondary round sometimes occurs over inspection if significant issues are found. And I keep harping on that because sometimes people want to object in the inspection. Objection, or also called notice to correct here in Colorado. They want to put a laundry list of every single thing in the inspection report, from scratch floors to window seals to doors that don't seal properly. And many of these items can be resolved with a handyman in a couple of hours. And what happens is that the seller gets annoyed. if you just send this giant laundry list. So I usually recommend people focus on 3 to 5 major issues that are true surprises that you did not know. And so if the roof is visibly bad from the street, that's arguably something that you should have seen. But you're not a roofer. You could sort of hang your hat on the fact that you're not a roofer. But if the
And
roof looked okay from the street and it turns out it had hail damage, well, we didn't know that. Or the sewer line was bad. We didn't run a scope through the sewer line before
on our showing,
writing the offer.
Yeah.
So you can't sell a house with a bad sewer. A house has got to have a functioning sewer line.
And
Okay,
similarly, roofs, right? Like most conventional loans won't cover a house with a poor roof.
That's right.
Yeah.
That the insurance won't cover it because it already has a bad roof, and the roof needs to be replaced before closing. But in that particular instance, with the roof, it has a short fixed life, 15 to 20 years for most composite shingle roofs, even though they say they're 30, they're not. And so right around year 10 is probably about half-life. And what we usually recommend to our clients, and this came out of aircraft leasing, is that, look, these major systems of the house should be at half-life or better. And if it's at the end of its life, it's reasonable to ask for a credit or the system to be replaced. But you weren't expecting a brand new roof when you wrote the offer or a brand new furnace. So how do you feel about the seller paying for half that cost? And most of the time, for most reasonable people, that passes the sniff test and we can move past this issue and agree on that. Occasionally, it doesn't work. Occasionally, people are, for whatever reason, they feel like they're being taken advantage of, and
well, when you submit that laundry list, right, it almost can come across like a list of demands, like a ransom note or something, right?
That's right. And it's not a ransom note. And so this is where the communication between agents is so crucial. And an experienced agent knows it's not a ransom note, knows their job is to find out, okay, what's it going to get your buyer to reach, the closing table? Because obviously we're not going to fix this entire laundry list, but we're willing to credit your buyer something. And usually the seller doesn't want to do the work, and the buyer is really angling for a credit if they're smart anyway, because you don't want the seller doing the work. All they're going to do is shoddy work with the cheapest available contractor. That's their mission. So you want the credit, not the work. And you can apply the credit in various ways. That's a conversation for a different podcast.
And if you go ahead.
And it may vary by state. Go ahead.
And if you do want, if the seller ends up doing the work, it's such a tread lightly, but also, have your expectations and what you'd like out of the deal in mind as you go forwards. Though there has been instances where it's like, if the seller's going to fix this, you must use said contractor, or, these are your range of options, right?
That can be negotiated, right? So in the past, I would often write my inspection resolutions with seller to replace the roof, seller to use Boulder roofing, which historically has done a great job for our clients. They're not the cheapest roofer, but we know they have good cleanup, good follow-up. And even though they recently have changed ownership, they continue to do great work. When it changed owners, now it's owned by a gentleman named Dan Banjo. So far, it's been consistently high performance with every referral we've sent it to them.
Not sponsored.
So not sponsored. Oh yeah, nothing is sponsored.
No.
Nothing on every year, dozens of requests to advertise on the blog, on our website, write content, and the answer has never been yes. Since 2005, the answer has been thank you for your interest, but no thank you. We don't take advertising. And so no, Dan Banjo has been great, and Boulder Roofing has been great, and we name we praise by name, we criticize by category, and that's why I'm mentioning Boulder Roofing. So it's usually reasonable to end up at half-life provision, and in the past I would often specify contractor if we are going to have the seller do the work with a contractor that's acceptable to the buyer, and their pricing might be a little bit higher, but it's not insanely higher, so that usually works out. But
You're
prefer
saying,
not to generally to negotiate repairs being made, because now you're dealing with contractor schedules, and the lender is going to want to see the roof replaced and get verification the roof is replaced. It delays closing, which introduces the possibility of anything can happen if we're delaying closing. So it's a tougher negotiation and a more challenging deal if the seller is doing the work. And the seller doesn't have to agree to any of this. The seller can tell you to go pound sand. We're not fixing anything. We have a better offer in our pocket. Take it or leave it. And we've done that when we had a better offer in our pocket representing the seller. Tell the buyer to go pound sand.
And it's typically signaled. Typically, I say it's signaled before you go under contract, maybe in the listing on a showing or on the listing description, that the seller is not willing to budge. Typically.
So the problem with writing it into the listing description, into even the private broker remarks, home is sold as is, seller will not address inspection issues. The challenge with that is that it signals to the market this house is a dump.
Mm-hmm.
This house has major issues and the seller just wants to get out. And if you signal that, you're likely to end up with a much lower price. So here's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Here's our best practice. And we pay for this. We will advise our clients to get a pre-inspection. We give them the list of inspectors we like. And at closing, we will pay a pre-sale inspection. We will credit the seller back for the cost they incurred. Is usually between $500 and $1,000. To get that list from a quality inspector of the problems with the house. And now, before we go active, if there is an issue with the sewer line, if there is an issue with the roof, we either disclose it or we fix it. And we fix it with our contractor. No one ever says, oh my God, I'm not happy with this other roofing company that did the roof that's already on the house. They're just thrilled they got a new roof. Mm-hmm. But if you wait for it to be a pressure point in the inspection negotiation, now you're dealing potentially with the gold-plated contractor. And Boulder Roofing is not gold-plated, but there are some that are. There is a plumbing company in town known to be usually 2 times the normal estimate. And if we're looking for a high estimate, they're who we're calling, right? If you want to maximize the value of your credit. And every real estate agent that's been doing this for a while knows this contractor. I don't need to say who they are. Like, this is who you call when you want the overpriced.
And this can even be signaled too, right? Like, if you have a contractor come out and give estimates on this inspection issue, you can in your objection mention, hey, this price seems a little high. This is just what the estimate came back at. I'm happy if we shop around. It's like this is conversation.
It's negotiation.
Yeah.
But the key is, do you have enough time for this negotiation? So sometimes people want to play chicken over the inspection, and there is a deadline. So usually we structure 2 full days between objection and resolution. And if it looks like we need more time, we ask for more time. And if we've behaved ethically and professionally, typically the seller will grant us more time if we're objecting to real issues, because they know they're going to have to either disclose or fix this issue for the next buyer. So usually it's better to work it out with the first buyer. And that's what an experienced agent will tell you. You're working with an inexperienced agent where you decide to do a FSBO, people get emotional and dumb. And bad things happen. Still, it is what it is. And our job is to represent our clients in these transactions. So ultimately, our clients are going to make the call. But that ticking clock, right? If the deadline is 8 p.m. to reach resolution, and you've not reached resolution, in Colorado, the contract automatically terminates. So you have to withdraw your objection at 7:59 or earlier. Otherwise, you're out of contract. And so you can choose to call the bluff if you think the seller is bluffing, or you can choose to withdraw if you can't reach resolution. And most of the time, in the vast majority of our deals, we actually come to reasonable resolution between buyer and seller, and our deals go smoothly. But every once in a while, we deal with counterparties that I don't know what happens. They get their feathers riled up. But usually there's signs before you get to the finish line, before you get to the verbal negotiation, and you're sitting in the room or on the call. There are usually signs that you can read the tea leaves about how this is going to go. Mm-hmm. And we usually do our best to advise our client about how this is probably going to go. We're still going to do our best to get them what they want, but it doesn't always work out. And the signs, the tea leaves that are signaled, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, can come back to play when we're actually sitting down to iron this out. So be careful with what you write into your contract, because you may have handcuffed yourself to a limited inspection
and
or no inspection.
I think you've alluded to this, but haven't said it outright. But there's something to be said for if you're the principal on a deal, maybe you shouldn't be negotiating that deal.
Well. I think that's exactly right, Hamish.
Yeah.
And I think you see this pattern in all high dollar transactions. Very rarely will the principal be involved with the direct negotiation. They will be directing their team, but they will not personally make the phone call. They will not personally write the email. They will have their team do it. And this is for high dollar negotiations for athletes, executives, the C-suite. We years ago were involved with a deal with Richard Branson and Virgin Airlines. And even though these are, I mean, $20, $30 million, $50 million deals, no one actually talked to Richard.
Mm-hmm.
It was his team. And I don't know how involved he is in day-to-day running of his business, but for sure he wasn't getting involved personally. His reputation was there though in the deal, which was very fun.
Yeah, but you're gonna have to tell me some more about that. I didn't know that one. I
have vague memories of it. I just remember sort of the atmosphere of negotiating with his team and this perception of his aggressiveness that was portrayed to us without him having to express it directly to us. This is so long ago. That's all I remember. That he's a tough negotiator and a really savvy one. So you have to be able to understand your BATNA, right? And this is actually real estate related. So let's talk about Branson a little more. There's a story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I recall reading it in his book, his biography or autobiography, and it was about his acquisition of Necker Island. So we're talking about real estate, and he apparently flew out his girlfriend at the time on a helicopter to go look at Necker Island, and supposedly it was just to impress her. He wasn't actually seriously thinking about buying an island. And they did this tour of the island and then flew back. And the broker called and said, we'd love to get an offer from you. So he went ahead and lowballed a ridiculous number. And the broker went silent. He said, no, that's not going to work. I know he didn't go. It was rejected out of hand. So the offer was so low that there was no counter.
Which is what you expected a few years ago. You and your buyer, wasn't it? On the Boulder property.
Which Boulder property are you talking about?
The one from the 4 Mile that they were rebuilding.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for the condo downtown. Yes, I expected a counter because we went low, but not so low that it would be rejected out of hand. So that's the goal with the initial low offer. Is unless you're willing to just there's of course strategy is everything. Okay, your strategy could be that's a stale listing. Let's lowball. They're going to reject it, and then we'll come back in a week or two. We've set that initial price point, and now that anchor. It's called in negotiation. Now you need the magic ingredient of time. Come back in a week or two and offer slightly more. They're still anchored to that initial price, and you pretend you are too. And you're saying, well, look, I initially offered you $550, and you rejected it. Now we're at $575. We've come up $25,000, which is make up believe you've come up anything, but you've claimed to come up, right? So you anchored yourself.
It looks that's working for it, right?
That's right. That's right. So with Necker Island, a year passes and the broker calls Richard Branson back and says, look, you were the only offer we got in a year. Are you still interested? Because the seller will sell it to you at that price. And so that's how he basically stole Necker Island and got it at an incredible deal because nobody else offered, and he lowballed and waited. And so time is this magic ingredient in negotiations that you have to, one, you have to sometimes be prepared to walk away. That's knowing your BATNA. And two, you have to understand the role of time with price anchoring. And if somebody else, you have to be prepared that somebody else is going to use your anchor. So if you offer low and walk away and come back in 2 weeks, the seller is still at that anchor, whether or not buyer number 2 knows it. And if they come in with a slightly better offer, they're in a way more advantageous position. So this is why we always ask the listing agent, if we're on the buy side, have you had other offers? Right? You're trying to, and sometimes they tell you way more than they should tell you.
That's why a phone call is always better too.
It's always step one for the beginning of negotiations. Is to understand and then take it with a grain of salt because they may not be telling you the truth at all. And in a bidding war, you never know. We've had not countless. We've had many where initially it looked like we were getting 4 offers and then we got 1.
In the go ahead.
And then we're maintaining the illusion that there were 4 offers and we accepted the top offer the whole way to closing, and we never ever tell the other side whether there was 1 offer or 4 offers. We just maintain the illusion. We don't disclose. We don't show the other offers. Our job when we're selling is to represent the seller's best interest. And sometimes that means maintaining an atmosphere of scarcity for the buyer, even if that scarcity evaporated. And I'm a bad liar. So this is usually not an in-person conversation. It's either an email or a phone call. And I don't like to lie about anything, but our job is a little different when we represent the seller. We are here to maximize sale price, minimize time on market, and not use human nature that would potentially give the buyer doubt on the value of the asset. We don't do that. That would damage our seller and the net price.
One of the most viewed articles on our blog is the other offer fake, and I think that comes up a lot. Is the other
Yeah.
offer? Yeah.
And it's possible, and you'll never know. And this is why, if you're on the buy side, you just should feel confident about this offer. And other people's desire for this property should not influence what you think it's worth. You should look at the comps.
Mm-hmm.
You should do your homework before you write the offer. And if you're feeling a lack of confidence mid-transaction that you think maybe the other offers were fake, it probably wasn't the right offer in the beginning, and you probably shouldn't have offered. And I would even say your agent didn't do a good job educating you about the market if you're feeling doubtful about the value of this property. And if you are feeling doubtful, it's never too late to talk to your agent about it, because one, you could still potentially terminate on an inspection issue if there is one. You could still have an appraisal or loan issue, but you may be out of contingencies. And that's a problem. You may have to walk away from your earnest money. And your agent's job is to walk you through your options and your legitimate exits in the contract. Agents should not be promoting illegitimate exits and encouraging their clients to act in bad faith, because that's an instant loss of earnest money, or worse, if you check that box about specific performance. With that said, it's not uncommon that people try to get out on disingenuous reasons. And our job, if we're on the buy side, our job is not to moralize. Our job is to execute our client's strategy within the rules and the legal and ethical rules that govern our industry. And sometimes, occasionally, I have to remind my client that if you're asking me to do this, it's an exercise of bad faith. I'm going to do what you tell me to do because I'm your agent. But I'm also going to warn you that disingenuous exits, because you are getting cold feet, if they figure this out, it could cost you a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay. What else are we talking about? We've talked about the role of the ticking clock. We've talked about reading the signs of your counterparty. Let's talk about disclosures a little bit. I think this might be a useful adjunct to this topic. And in Colorado, and probably it's true in most states, agents have a proactive duty to disclose material defects in the property if they know about them. And sellers are supposed to fill out the seller's property disclosure. And one of the attorneys who used to advise real estate agents in Colorado, very famous guy named Oliver Frascona, called the SPD, seller's property disclosure, the document on which the seller lies about what they know about the house. Like, you have to take it with a giant grain of salt that this is even remotely accurate. But the seller is supposed to fill this out. And if they don't fill it out, it is a pretty big yellow flag. And it gets really interesting if the agent knows things that are bad about the house too, and then fails to disclose. I mean, it's proving it is a whole nother story. But once these things kind of add up to hesitancy when you're selling a property, and frankly, it can cost the seller a lot of money. Not doing an SPD is not a good idea, because even if you haven't lived in the house in 40 years, you probably know when the furnace was replaced. You probably know if there was a water leak. You probably know if there was a mold claim by a tenant. You know these things, right? And so who are you kidding? When you're paying the bills for repairs, you know what's wrong with the house. So even if they're a landlord and you haven't lived in the house for a long time, it's sort of a joke. I don't know why they're getting this advice to not fill out an SPD, but they get this advice, and sometimes we have to deal with that. And so that plays into offer price, that plays into the inspection language and the additional provision section. If we're going to create language that carves back the inspection, people sometimes use what's called health and safety language. They're only going to object if it's a health and safety issue. Well, then you're arguing over whether a cracked sidewalk is a safety issue or not, right? The real estate commission sides with buyers, by the way. Generally speaking, if the buyers have acted in good faith, it's their sole subjective discretion on what's a serious issue and what's not. But when you put in language in the additional provisions, suddenly it could be argued what is real and what's not.
And that can be, saying health and safety, although it's still fairly subjective, it still signals a little bit more willingness to work with the seller, right? there is kind of an advantage of that language.
Yep. So now we're talking about writing the offer and how to influence the seller to favor your offer, even if you're not the highest price. And before we got into this podcast, we kind of touched on this subject. Are there some secrets in how we write our offers and how we negotiate? And the answer is that we have norms for our behavior and how we advise our clients. I have a whole multi-page write-up in how to write a better offer that we give to our clients that are under buyer agency. And then we advise them specifically on how to pull these levers in certain ways to favor you. And a lot of it is soft signaling. I can't emphasize this enough. It's a contract that does not have lots of errors. It's a contract that is intelligently written and maybe dials back a little bit on inspection, or maybe you're covering a little bit of a low appraisal, because that's their biggest fear. Good negotiation is negotiating against the other side's deal points. You have to know what their deal points are. And their deal points are highest price with the highest probability of closing. And so are they going to terminate on inspection? Are they going to terminate on appraisal? Are they going to get loan approval? Are they paying cash? Do they really have cash? Are they going to try to sneak in a loan after they wrote a cash offer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like the quarterback sneak is sneaking a loan, which a lot of people want to do, although it was more common when rates were at 5% than at rates at 7%. Usually they're just moving cash to real estate rather than keeping it in liquid assets. So soft signaling is a really big piece of this. And it's one of the reasons when I write an offer, the first thing I do is call and have a conversation with the listing agent. And of course, I know they want the highest price with the least amount of hassle, but what's the ideal closing date? Not just for the seller. What's the ideal closing date for the listing agent? I'm trying to treat the listing agent like a human. Maybe they've got a vacation planned. Okay. And we don't want to close in the middle of their vacation. We can close a week later. What works best for you, Miss Listing Agent? Like, we don't want to interrupt your niece's graduation party you have to fly out of town for, and you have to pay another agent to cover you. What works best for you? And those are the types of questions I want to know before we write the offer. And often the listing agent will disclose other things that are useful in how we craft that offer. I will ask, do you have an inspection report? Do you have an SPD that we can look at? Sometimes they put this online. Sometimes the listing agent's so busy and rushing that they haven't had time to upload the SPD. We have a listing that just went live yesterday. The seller hasn't completed the SPD. We're trying to get it on them. They did do an inspection, and we're going to try to get that SPD online before showings begin. But maybe it doesn't happen. I would like the potential buyer, to review the SPD before they write their offer, to review the inspection report before they write their offer, because it's less likely they're going to find a deal killer on the inspection. And that increases the chances of closing. So all of those things play. And asking if it's available is really vital. Now, look, sometimes, especially in Denver at lower price points, the agent's getting 20 offers. And their job, they're not going to have time to talk to 20 agents necessarily. Although I will say that if your agent shows you 20 offers, they really screwed up. Period. You should never be dealing with 20 offers at the table. This agent should be encouraging people to submit strong offers. And once they get an offer at a certain price point, they should communicate to the other side, look, we have an offer at $10,000 over list price with pretty strong contingencies. If you're thinking about an offer significantly below list, you probably shouldn't bother.
And that's
right?
just a
Because
courtesy.
It's such a courtesy, but you're also using that. You're simultaneously encouraging people to submit higher offers and stronger offers. And the weak offers should not enter the table. You're wasting a lot of time by doing that. And if your agent says we got 19 offers, this is not a sign of a good agent. It's a sign of a bad agent when you have 20 offers at the table. And if you're bragging about it, and I often heard about this during the heat of the bidding wars, we got 12 offers, it's amazing. Like, you should never really be getting more than 3 or 4. Like, you can't effectively negotiate with more than even 2 or 3 at once, right? Because your job is to take those 2 or 3 great offers and make them better as the listing agent. You should be playing these offers against each other, maybe having us another round where everyone does a highest and best. And that's part of the strategy your agent should be discussing with you before you start getting offers in hand. Yeah, especially if it looks like you're getting multiple offers. So what about the BATNA for the seller?
What's the BATNA?
The seller also needs the best alternative to negotiated agreement on price, inspection. Maybe it's a low appraisal and now you've got to renegotiate. The seller also needs to know the value of their home and understand it not based on wishful thinking or what their neighbor up the street sold a home for, but actually on the market for their specific property type, location, condition. All of that plays in. And the neighbor across the street or up the street might have had a much better home, much bigger home. The market could have been radically different a year ago. All of that plays into what's your alternative if you don't reach resolution with the buyer over their objection. And so, again, market knowledge is not just for the buy side. It's critical for the sell side for knowing what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate and negotiate on. And communicating that to the other side is also vital in a way that's professional, in a way that's based in authenticity, because experienced agents can also see the data. Experienced agents can also call other agents that have deals under contract and see how many offers they got, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes inexperienced agents are a blessing, and sometimes they're a nightmare. Sometimes we can push an inexperienced agent to push their client to waive certain things or offer more, and do things they normally shouldn't have done. But our job depends on who we're representing, but it's always to represent the best interests of our clients. And we always let our clients make the call if there are decisions to be made.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
On the sell side, it's tricky. You're here, say you're in the midst of an inspection or objection. Okay, now you've been made aware of some issues on your house, and if you walk away, you now have to disclose it to the next person, and then
that's right.
Yeah, and you also got the mark of being under contract and then going back on the list, and there's a lot of downsides.
You don't have a giant red A, but you have a giant red FL on your chest. So that's from, I can't remember, Scarlet Letter, right? The A for adultery that the characters have to wear. This is an FL, a failed listing mark on your forehead that you now have to wear because everyone's going to conclude something's wrong with your listing. And you now have to disclose that the house has a bad sewer line, has a cracked foundation, has a bad roof, has bad grading, whatever it is that came up on the inspection report. If it's a material defect, you are now required to disclose it as a listing. Your agent has to disclose it too. And you as a seller are required to disclose material defects. So how are you going to hide from this? So your options are work with a party in hand or work with the bird in the bush that might come after you terminate, but you still are going to have to deal with this mark of Cain. That's not the right term. I don't even know what that means necessarily. But it is a mark.
Yeah.
It is a mark against you for having a failed listing or with a listing that came back to market. It's going to cost you more money. And your agent should be advising you of the consequences and then let you make a decision. And maybe it is the right decision. But sometimes people get emotional and they get their feathers ruffled and they get offended by an inspection objection, and they do make bad decisions. And we see it often on both sides when it comes to the secondary round of negotiation over inspection, if there is one. If you've done your inspection, or if you've done your pre-sale inspection, Hamish, there usually isn't a major second round over inspection issues. It's rare.
And you know what to expect as the seller. You can kind of see things happen before they do. You can manage your expectations, and it's good to know beforehand, always.
It's good to know, especially if it's something like mold that's discovered, right? Because mold freaks people out. And usually, a piece of bread in a damp room will mold. A piece of bread, even in a regular room. Here in Colorado, if you leave a piece of bread out, it's going to mold and set off the mold triggers. And if you address it proactively and retest it, most buyers are going to feel like, okay, well, it's probably fine, right? There is risk in over disclosing too. So you really need to be careful with how you present your inspection report and how you addressed it. And the level of detail is very important to consider. And the story is very important to consider. This is the last story because we're now over an hour. And in this story, we're coming up on an hour. I think we started a little bit after the clock started.
Yeah.
So years ago, I wrote an offer on a house in Table Mesa in a bidding war. Our offer was cash and was really strong. And they decided to go with a different offer that was lower priced than ours. And I was like, what happened? Like when it closed, they closed for less than what we wrote our contract for. And their answer was that we just thought your offer was you guys are going to be too difficult. And the reason they felt that way is because in the additional provision section of the contract, we wrote, and I don't have the exact verbiage in front of me, but it was something along the lines of buyer, once under contract, shall have the ability to bring in their architect to evaluate the home up to 3 times before closing, or something very specific. And the reason for that was that the buyer was planning an extensive remodel on the property and wanted the ability to bring the architect in and didn't want to be arguing with the seller about whether we have the right to do so. Now, the contract already has language in there around allowing certain visits for certain reasons. And often after inspection, you're actually not allowed to. But even then, most sellers will accommodate you because it's just good sense, right? Instead, we made it contractual and scared the hell out of the seller. I wrote this provision. This is years ago, like a lawyer would. My client was a Harvard MBA guy, really successful. We got really granular, which is what you do in professional contracts at a high level, right? A business acquiring a business, you really want to get the terms right. And in those cases, you have an attorney review the contract too. That adds a whole nother layer of questions and provisions. And unfortunately, in the world of residential real estate,
especially with the breadth of professionalism,
well, you run the risk of scaring the other side, especially if they've never seen this before, right? You've written a 300-word essay in the additional provisions. You're just going to scare the hell out of the seller,
or
because your agent is scared.
ridiculously strict due diligence requests. Those are
giant laundry list of due diligence documents.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to scare them too. You should put something in there, and maybe you add things to it after you're under contract. And if the seller doesn't give it to you, well, they've in writing said they don't have it or they're not going to give it to you, then you can make a decision if you want to terminate or not based on a lack of due diligence documents. I mean, you've got grounds, but a laundry list of a long, lengthy paragraph of due diligence documents is probably going to scare the seller.
Yeah. Soft signaling.
And in a bidding war, what you signal can be the difference between going under contract or not. And the reality is there are very few homes that are desirable and priced right and worth buying, in my opinion. And when you find one that finally matches what you need in your budget, you probably need to think about that in how you write the offer and how you signal, because there's almost certainly going to be somebody else interested. The majority of homes we write that are really desirable, there's usually somebody else that's writing an offer at the same time. Unless the seller screwed up, overpriced it, broke up a few deals, and now is dealing with the taint of a relisted property, or it's a property that, is just not that desirable, right? It's something that might work for you, but may not work for the broad market. Then maybe it's a different story. But most of the time, there's usually another buyer that's also interested at the same time.
Yeah.
All right. Anything we failed to cover, Hamish?
I think we hit most of the points here.
Any searing questions as a potential buyer also looking for a home?
I have no, not really. I mean, this conversation helped me, and that first point of negotiation, get the initial price that you would be happy with if there were no other concessions or nothing else, makes everything else kind of a nice surprise if you do get that. But I'll say on the lighter side of things, when we're talking about removing the principal from the negotiation, there's a Key and Peele skit. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's something about my anger translator. And it's this couple and they're having a conversation, and then there's 2 people behind them that are shouting at each other. And so they can be very civil, but then have the actual emotions flying behind it. It reminded me of that. So,
yeah. Oh, I mean, I've had clients tell me to tell the other side to profanity themselves.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, sure thing. And then not do it. Are you crazy? Like, do you really want to blow up this deal? Like if I do that, you're 100% going to blow up this deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so sometimes we have to act in our client's best interest and be the absorber of anger and emotion, and then express it as professionally as we can to the other side. Our client doesn't feel that what you feel are real concerns are actually real concerns. Not, are these people idiots?
Yeah.
No, if you say that, you're just going to offend people. Like, you really have to consider how you express yourself and what your role is as the agent in the transaction, and calming people down and letting them see, what the potential ways through this are, and staying focused on the deal points are the job of your negotiator or your agent in this case. I don't know. It's such a fun business, Hamish. It's not what I envisioned. Having worked on Wall Street, having worked for investment firms, and always having a very high professional bar. I mean, occasionally there was debauchery and Wolf of Wall Street behavior, but most of the time it was very professional. And then in the real estate world, the spectrum of people that have no clue what they're doing and people that do dozens of transactions a year and have done that for decades is night and day. And it's just it's such a wild roller coaster sometimes for us to figure out who we're dealing with and then act accordingly, and advise our clients accordingly on how to think about this. So I think that's about it for this particular podcast. I do want to mention that we have lots of social media. You can check out our YouTube. You can check out our Instagram. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. Our primary business is Denver and Boulder, and we now have listings in the mountains in Breckenridge. We're serving clients in the mountains as well. We have several new listings coming on market in the Boulder foothills. And we're at houseeinstein.com. If you're looking to us for real estate services, we're more than happy to talk to you on the phone about your real estate needs and advise you to the best of our ability.
Absolutely.
So reach out to us at houseeinstein.com.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you next time.
All righty.